All right, well, we're gonna go ahead and get started to respect y'all's lunch hour and make sure that we got the timing down good. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Bear with me a little bit. I'm a little under the weather, but thankfully Lorelai's gonna be the one presenting, so you won't have to hear from me too much. Um, I'm sure y'all got a notification that we are recording this. So I just want to give y'all a heads up. Anything like, said will be part of the recording. If you want to keep your cameras on, that's awesome. That will also be part of the recording. I'm going to stop it at the end so that you do have an opportunity to ask questions off, the recording if you would like, if that would make you feel more comfortable. But I did want to give you all a heads up that kind of like, staying in this is authorizing us to use this video on our YouTube. And it's for the purpose of being able to share this with people who couldn't come today. I guess to start off, and I always forget to do this, my name is Faith Namashef. I'm the ARP Counseling and Outreach Coordinator with Rape Counselors of East Alabama. That means I do a lot of virtual events, and that means that I work with our victims. I provide them mental health therapy because I'm an LCSW. We are going to be talking today about individuals with disabilities and sexual assault. Lorelei is one of our MSW interns, and we are so glad to have her presenting this and making this presentation and talking about this because this is kind of one of her like special interest areas, and we always encourage that with our interns and what they want to share because I'm sure you guys all know this too in our field. Things change so rapidly. It's nice to have a refresher on things and all that good stuff. So, if you don't mind, do keep yourselves muted just to reduce that background noise and make sure that, we're not having anything going on that would mess up the audio. But if you do have questions, send them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question when appropriate, totally fine. We will have a designated time at the end for questions. But yeah, I think that is everything. So I'm going to let Lorelei go ahead and get started. And thank you again for joining us. So I'm excited.
Thanks so much, Faith. I really appreciate it. So again, as Faith introduced me earlier, my name is Lorelei Deaton. I'm an MSW intern with University of Kentucky, and I'm currently completing my practicum at Rape Counselors of East Alabama. Just here on the side, we've got a little bit of a rundown of what RCEA is. It's an organization dedicated to supporting victims of sexual assault and rape. We provide a 24/7 hotline. It's constantly manned. We provide individual and group counseling, thanks to Faith here. We do court and medical advocacy and accompaniment. So we'll go to court with you. We'll go to SANE exams. Basically, whenever you need us, we're there. And then we also go to schools to provide psychoeducation, to just kind of do some presentations, kind of what I'm doing now, but maybe a little bit more in depth. Basically whatever they want and need. Caseload kind of varies on call volumes, advocacy needs, therapeutic needs, but that's enough about.
So that's good.
I'm sorry. Sorry about that. But that is enough about RCEA. Let's go ahead and get started with individuals with disabilities and sexual assault. Who is at risk of sexual assault? Let's talk about that first. Most individuals who experience sexual assault experience the first assault as a child. And the more when you're after your very first exposure to sexual assault, to unwanted sexual contact, you are at a higher risk of being re-victimized. Individuals currently incarcerated are at an extremely high risk of sexual assault. Individuals with singular or multiple disabilities, especially those who are nonverbal, who have communicative barriers, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, they're also at a high risk of sexual assault. And then finally, individuals who qualify for the collegiate red zone, which we're going to talk about that here soon, they're also at a high risk of sexual assault. So let's give you some quick facts and talk about a little bit about the red zone. So some of our quick facts. Individuals with disabilities are at a much higher risk of sexual assault than the rest of the population. An individual with a disability is twice as likely to encounter unwanted sexual contact than an individual who does not possess a disability. Those with sensory disabilities are at the highest risk of sexual assault, with 4 times the risk than an individual with singular or multiple disabilities. So, not even including individuals without disabilities, even within their own category, they are at the highest risk. Individuals with disabilities are also at a high risk of sexual assault as they age, which is almost, if you're a little familiar with sexual assault as a topic, you'll know that usually children and elderly are kind of a high risk, special risk category, but individuals with disabilities are backwards. As they age up, they become more and more at risk. And I'll talk a little bit on my theory as to why, because there's not a lot of data. There's some data gaps surrounding as to why that is. And then also, individuals with disabilities are less likely than those without disabilities to report a sexual assault, both formally and informally, which again, we're going to talk about a little bit of that here soon. So let's start off with education, sexual education. Individuals with disabilities are usually not provided or afforded sexual education due to social stigmas surrounding them as non-sexual individuals. So usually what ends up happening is people will see these individuals, see a person with a disability, and nobody really thinks of them as a sexual person, as somebody who is sexually active. Oftentimes, the stigma surrounding them is that they are asexual or incapable sometimes of engaging in sexual acts. That leaves them far more vulnerable to sexual abuse. Consent, for example, is usually not taught to them. Consent for, in general, not taught to them, let alone sexual encounters. When sexual contact does occur, when these individuals do start becoming sexually active, there's a power imbalance because they don't have the proper social education needed to, I guess, participate, understand really what's going on. Sexual assault and rape education also not usually provided to individuals with disabilities. So when something occurs, when unwanted sexual contact happens, or an assault, or maybe somewhere that's in a gray area that the individual doesn't know, it's kind of a question for them. Was that rape? Was that sexual assault? Did I want that? Because they weren't educated. The third one here, kind of one of the more dangerous ones, is domestic violence and intimate partner violence. That education also not provided to them. This can lead to very dangerous situations in potentially abusive relationships. It can be very scary because if that individual is sexually abusing them, they may not know any better because they were not provided that education. They were not provided the social awareness that they deserved. And that kind of brings us to our next slide, the red zone. So we just talked about, sorry, we just talked about lack of education, how individuals with disabilities aren't seen as sexually active beings. So let's say you have someone who's not considered sexually active, an individual with a disability. They're going off to college, they're going off to get an education. The red zone is a concept currently understudied. It was first coined, I want to say back in the 1980s. Don't quote me on that one. First coined back in the 1980s, it was a concept to pinpoint when women were most likely to be sexually assaulted during their first year of college. Currently, they've found that between August and November, so August, September, October, November, those 4 months, those are considered high risk months. That's the red zone. That's when sexual assault, unwanted sexual contact, rape, sexual harassment, so on and so forth, that's when that happens. Taking into consideration that adults with disabilities already possess a high risk of being sexually assaulted. So, like I said earlier, adult as an individual with a disability ages as they become an adult, they get a higher and higher risk. College freshmen with disabilities are probably at one of the highest risk categories to experience sexual assault. College freshman women, sorry, College freshman women in their first year are more likely to be sexually assaulted than women in their second year, third year, fourth year, so on and so forth. Individuals with disabilities during their entire time at college, that risk factor doesn't drop. It stays at a stagnant level. Now, to be fair, there are incredible data gaps surrounding the red zone and individuals with disabilities. So, trying to cross section this concept, there are a lot of the conclusions are difficult to draw from. There are so many data gaps. Do we have any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and if you have any questions, throw them down in the chat box or just go ahead and unmute yourself. In the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead and throw us to the next slide. Individuals with disabilities and support system barriers. Formal and informal reporting, I kind of talked a little bit on that earlier. So individuals with disabilities are more likely than those without to report their sexual assault in a formal manner compared to an informal manner. Now, formal reporting, I should say, it's including, but it's not limited to your law enforcement, your SANE program, cross referral services, victim advocates. But informal reporting is family, friends, maybe you want to bring it up to a boyfriend, girlfriend, a spouse, anything like that, which is fantastic. There's nothing wrong with formal or informal reporting, but here are some concerns regarding both styles of reporting. Individuals who informally report, go to family, friends, whoever, they're less likely to be connected to post-assault services. So a SANE exam, therapy, legal services. If they want to press charges against that individual, they're less likely to be referred to or connected to post-assault services. This disparity is most likely due to a lapse in education. So maybe the persons that they informally report to don't know the routes that are necessary, the routes that are wanted or needed. They don't know how to offer the options. It's maybe something that they're just not aware of. It could also be something that apologies, may not be something that they're aware of. It could also be something that they don't know how to approach with that person. Individuals who informally report their sexual assault but still want those services, they are twice as less likely to receive those services. Just got a question from Dawn Trainer. At colleges and schools, are disability services now able/required to educate their clients present day? That I do not know at this time, but if you will put your email down in the chat and I will get that answer to you by end of day. Let me go ahead and pop on over to our next slide. Families of individuals with disabilities and sexual assault. Family members of individuals with disabilities, while normally a fantastic support system that's usually your first line of support is your family, can also be a contributor to suffering for victims of after a sexual assault. So, individuals with disabilities are most likely to be sexually assaulted by a family member, and I will talk about why in another slide here soon. Due to surrounding social stigmas around individuals with disabilities, family members are more likely to disbelieve them. So, let's say you have a child with a cognitive disability. They go to their mom and they say that their teacher touched them wrong, they touched them in a weird place. Well, mom may have a certain concept or stigma or may possess an idea of how her child is supposed to act and supposed to talk because of her disability. And she chalks up, without investigating further, she chalks it up to that's just her disability talking. Oftentimes what happens with these stigmas, with social stigmas, and this isn't just for family members, this is for anybody who leans into those social stigmas, it's comforting because it gives you a routine. Oh, she's dyslexic. She's not really going to know how to read this properly, but she can. She's blind, so she doesn't really know if what she was feeling, that guy touching her, was what she was feeling, but she does. It's comforting to lean into a stigma because it provides a program. You, when you lean into a stigma, you lean into the disability, you rely on that instead of the person that's communicating to you, I was raped. Finally, family members who do believe that individuals with disabilities may not have the proper education or resources to fully support the victim. So, like I was talking about in the previous slide, you can, the individual can go to their family, friends, say, hey, I was sexually assaulted. And they're, let's say they have a really good support system, they're going to get as much support as possible, comfort, empathy, sympathy, whatever's needed. But they may not know, such as formal routes of reporting, that they should or could or need or want, entirely depends on what the individual wants, of course, that they could go receive medical care, that they could press charges against the individual or individuals, that they can go to court, that they could get a restraining order, they could get compensation, so on and so forth. It's not something that everyone just knows off the top of their head. Uh, Brings us to the compromised support system. So I was talking about earlier how individuals with disabilities are usually sexually assaulted by a family member. Here's why. Individuals with disabilities who experience sexual assault most likely know their attacker. That's supposed to say most likely. My apologies for that typo. They most likely know their attacker. Oftentimes, that attacker is their direct caregiver or someone within their support system or the caregiver's support system, such as a family member. So let's say a mom is taking care of a her physically disabled daughter. So daughter, she's wheelchair bound, right? Can't really move her legs. She needs help getting around. So she's her primary caregiver. Well, mom needs a break, or she relies on family members to help. So she won't just rely on the individual siblings or a spouse. She's going to rely on her family, her support system as well. So we have uncles and aunts and cousins and so many different people coming in. And the more people that are added, while the support system is large, so is the potential for sexual assault, for any kind of compromise. Individuals with these constraints are going to find themselves at a very high risk of being sexually assaulted by someone in their support system. This is not an exhaustive list, it's just kind of an example. So, those who require physical dependence on others, especially for intimate hygiene. So, a young boy who needs help bathing or needs help getting dressed. Individuals who require lifelong care from a caregiver, because remember, as they age, the risk goes higher and higher and higher. They're getting more and more vulnerable. Now, I told you earlier that I was gonna give you my theory as to why, because there's currently no active or published, I should say, no published research on this topic. My theory is that as these people age, as they get away from their main support system, so mom, dad, any siblings, they start getting new caregivers, they start maybe getting into their own housing. Well, that exposes them to more people, and they don't have as many eyes in terms of family and friends watching them. There are newer people, there are more people getting into their lives that don't know them, and they don't entirely know if they can trust these people, but they don't have a choice necessarily. They literally have to do what they can. Individuals with cognitive or sensory disabilities, again, like we saw kind of earlier on, they also have extremely high risk of sexual assault. And then one of the most important constraints is communication barriers. Communication barriers. Communication barriers can prevent individuals with disabilities from being able to report unwanted sexual contact. These barriers can prevent them from receiving resources, from being able to tell that their support system has been compromised, to be able to explain, hey, I just experienced something by someone I know or don't know. They can't say anything. Some of these barriers include, but again, it's not an exhaustive list. Communicating in a preferred language that's discriminated by others. So maybe you're trying to, for someone who uses sign language, another person doesn't want to communicate in that language or doesn't want to call in an interpreter. And they're just like, no, you can write it down, or no, you need to figure out how to speak to me. Discrimination, that's which we're going to talk a lot more about here soon. Lack of access to communicative technology such as written language, braille, auditory language, sign language, and then of course lack of access to an advocate that can provide communicative or interpretive services. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little case study here. Sexual abuse in plain sight. What you're looking at is the Woodford School for Deaf Children. That image is the nursery where the children lived in. You see the gates, you can see the fencing. They weren't allowed to leave that building. And let me correct myself. They weren't allowed to leave that location. There was a nursery, there was a school, and it was all fenced in and gated and locked. They were literally trapped there. These children were being sexually abused by the headmaster in the open. And when I say sexually abused, I mean that the headmaster would walk into the classrooms, pick a kid that he wanted, and take them to his bedroom because he also lived on site in the nursery. His wife witnessed this abuse firsthand and did not intervene. The children being sexually abused reached out for help. They did call for help. They did reach out to others and say, help, this is happening. Help, I need help. Get me out. They didn't get that help. Why? Because this occurred during the 1950s and the 1980s. Social stigmas surrounding individuals with disabilities and deaf children especially meant that they were seen as lesser than. The harshest word that they were taught was rude. They knew the word rude. They didn't know rape. They didn't know sexual assault. They didn't know anything like that. They just knew rude. They didn't know inappropriate touch even. They were not properly educated in writing, so they weren't taught how to write. They were considered, because they were deaf, they were considered as less intelligent, as incapable of learning proper writing, so they were given a very basic vocabulary. They were only taught to lip read and speak English, which a lot of individuals who are deaf, who are hard of hearing, that is something that they do, but they weren't afforded sign language. Now, this is a school for deaf children. They weren't allowed to use sign language. In fact, if they were caught using sign language, if they were seen communicating to one another, oftentimes their hands were smacked with rulers. Oftentimes their hands were taped behind their back and they weren't allowed to use their hands for the rest of the day. They were also taped so the headmaster could use it as an excuse to punish them and sexually abuse them. This went on until the school closed in the 1980s. The sexual abuse reports, the children who grew up, they are still alive today. When they grew up, they did not report this abuse until, I want to say 2012. It did not come open to the public until 2015 after the headmaster and the headmaster's wife passed away. They took all the evidence that they had, went to the judge and said, here's what happened. These are firsthand accounts. These are images. There weren't a lot of pictures at the time. This is everything we have. And the judge dismissed them on basis of discrimination, on basis of that the headmaster was too old, that correction, that the headmaster was too old on a basis of discrimination and that there weren't enough witnesses, despite the fact that at least 5 individuals had stepped out and said, "This man sexually abused me." Now, healthcare and legal challenges of individuals with disabilities. We have some legal discrimination. Individuals with disabilities are less likely to report a crime, especially unwanted sexual contact. We don't entirely know the source for why this is. Again, there are a lot of data gaps regarding individuals with disabilities, especially with sexual assault. But the current theory of research is that individuals with disabilities face so much discrimination from various agencies and first responders and other systems, legal systems, that it's almost more exasperating to try and report a crime than it sorry, it's almost more exasperating to try and report a crime than it is to just deal with the consequences on their own. Law enforcement typically don't receive training on individuals with disabilities, and it makes a massive educational barrier that paves way for discrimination, regardless of intent on the law enforcement officer. Individuals with disabilities who are interviewed by the police historically are not afforded the right to an advocate during their interviews. So, like I was talking about earlier, that's a communication barrier, and that leaves way to that leads way to discrimination. Because again, what if that individual wants to communicate in a certain way that the law enforcement officer doesn't understand? They don't have a choice because they weren't offered an advocate, and they may not have the cognitive capability. For some individuals with certain cognitive disabilities, they may not have the ability to understand, I can ask for one. Discrimination in the healthcare system. Approximately 2/5 of individuals with disabilities report experiencing discrimination from healthcare providers. 2/5. That is 2 out of 5 people. They report experiencing some kind of discrimination, experiencing that they were not treated fairly or equally. This discrimination compounds then when you add sexual assault on top of that, when you add that kind of stress. Some of these barriers, again, not an exhaustive list. There are a lot, but some of these barriers include, but are not limited to, an interruption of treatment, a delay in care or even denial of care, lack of sexual health screening. So again, going back to earlier in the slides, people who lean into social stigmas often view individuals with disabilities, especially more visible disabilities, they view them as asexual or non-sexual people. They don't view them as individuals who can have a sexually active lifestyle. And then finally, no availability for accessible technology. So your communicative technology or couches that may be, or seats that may be more comfortable to sit in, that may be more designated for certain physical disabilities. Further accessible technology may include having a microphone or even something as simple as a writing pad for someone who cannot speak. They don't get that technology. Now, it's been shown that repeated exposure to discrimination within the healthcare system can worsen mental health in individuals with disabilities. It can compound, it can get worse and worse, and then you top on the after effects of a sexual assault, and it just makes a complete mess inside that individual's mind. It is stressful. It is constant exhaustion. It takes a physical toll on that person. That will be everything for my presentation. Does anybody have any questions on anything I've talked about? Anything that I can provide some clarity on? All right.
Sorry. How
No
would you
worries.
suggest that we get the information out more so that we can destigmatize this and and make it better for them.
I think one of the first things that we should start is with the individuals themselves. One of the things that we can do is start providing sexual education, and it's not necessarily something that has to be like super in depth, but at the very least, something that defines what is consent, what is sexual assault, especially for those with more cognitive disabilities, something that can just explain what is this touch? Am I okay with it? Something that's on their level, if that makes sense. Awesome. Any more questions?
Yeah, so I was just curious, do you know or did you see any information about why there's such little data, I guess, for these groups?
Honestly, going through all the references that I have, which if anybody is interested, I do have a reference list at the end of the slide. I'm more than willing to send to you if you want to look for yourself for on anything that I've spoken on today. But in terms of why there are so many data gaps, I think part of it is to do with stigma, and I think it's part of it is just the research has not occurred. Sexual contact, consensual and non-consensual, is just not something that's thought about when it comes to individuals with disabilities.
That makes sense. Yeah. So then because of the stigma, it doesn't happen, and then it doesn't happen, and then it cycle. Yeah.
Right.
For anyone who wanted to ask a question off recording, I'm going to stop the recording now.